She doesn't belong here, throw her out. My own children screamed in the courtroom. I stood paralyzed, humiliated in front of everyone, until the lawyer read a single line and their faces went white. The inheritance wasn't theirs, It was all mine. Within seconds, their cruelty turned to pleading. If you've made it this far, you probably recognize that families aren't always what we imagine. Right here on this channel, you'll find a safe space where real stories like mine are told without judgment. These stories will move you, make you reflect, and perhaps even help you better understand your own family experiences. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this community where every story matters and where you're always welcome. Now I'll tell you all the details of this experience that changed my life forever. The word family has always held sacred meaning for me. I grew up believing that blood ties were unbreakable, that the love between parents and children was the purest and most unconditional feeling in this world. Throughout my life, I put my family first, sacrificing dreams, desires, and personal needs in the name of this love I believed to be eternal and reciprocal. How wrong I was! How foolish I was to believe that this love would survive the greed, ambition, and selfishness that, without my realizing it, grew within the hearts of those I loved most in the world, my own children. My name is Margaret, I'm 62 years old, and I'm the widow of Thomas, an extraordinary man with whom I shared 35 years of my life. Thomas was a respected executive at a large technology company in Seattle, while I worked as a literature teacher at a local high school. Together, we built a comfortable life in the suburbs in a spacious house overlooking Lake Washington and raised 3 children, William, our eldest, now 34, Elizabeth, our middle daughter, 32, and Michael, our youngest, 28. We gave them the best we could offer: a quality private school education, music lessons, international vacation, travel, and unconditional support in their career choices. I believed we had raised whole, compassionate human beings, grateful for all they had received. How delusional I was! Thomas was always a cautious man with his finances. While I was more carefree, he planned each investment, meticulously thinking about the future, our retirement, and a legacy for our children. Over the decades, in addition to his work at the company, he invested in real estate, stocks, and various funds, building a considerable wealth that would guarantee us comfort and security in old age. We lived well, but never ostentatiously. Thomas believed in living comfortably, but without excess or waste. This mentality contrasted with that of our children, who grew up in a more consumerist, more immediate, and more focused on appearances and status generation. Everything changed when 2 years ago, Thomas was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer. The news fell like a bombshell on our family, shattering the sense of security and belonging we had cultivated for decades. The doctors were clear from the beginning. The prognosis was poor. The tumor was already advanced when it was discovered. Thomas, ever pragmatic, accepted the news with a dignity that still moves me today. As I burst into tears, he held my hands and said, "We've had a wonderful life together, Margaret. Now we need to be practical, organize everything for when I'm no longer here." In the weeks following his diagnosis, Thomas devoted much of his time he could have used to rest, to doing things he enjoyed, to organizing our financial and legal affairs. He met several times with Harold Jenkins, our lawyer and longtime friend, updating his will, reviewing investments, and leaving detailed instructions on every aspect of our estate. I attended some of these meetings, but I confess that financial details have never been my strong point. I had complete confidence in Thomas's judgment and his ability to make the best decisions for our family. The months of treatment were brutal. Chemotherapy, radiation, experimental medications. Thomas tried every option available, not out of fear of death, but out of a desire to buy time to ensure everything was properly organized before he left. During this difficult time, I hoped our children would be more present, more involved, more willing to offer emotional support, not only to Thomas, but also to me as I juggled the hospital, home doctors, and pharmacies, a physically and emotionally exhausting routine. William, who worked as an investment manager in New York, rarely showed up, always citing pressing work commitments. Elizabeth, an interior designer in Los Angeles, called frequently, but her visits were also few and far between. Michael, who had recently launched a tech startup in San Francisco, was the one who maintained the most regular contact, but his physical presence was still limited by his chaotic schedule as an entrepreneur. On the few occasions our children visited, I noticed something strange in their interactions with Thomas. Questions about specific investments, about properties, about values. Questions that seemed inappropriate considering their father's health. Thomas sensed this too, and after one particularly tense visit in which William practically interrogated his father about the details of a real estate investment, he said something to me that I didn't fully understand at the time. "They're counting on the money, Margaret. They've already made plans for what they'll do with the inheritance. Notice how rarely they ask how I feel, what my fears are, my final wishes. It's always about the assets, the money, the properties." I wanted to defend our children, attributing their behavior to their natural discomfort at the imminent loss, to the difficulty of dealing with their father's mortality. Thomas just smiled sadly and said, "You've always seen the best in people, especially our children. It's one of your most beautiful qualities, but it can also be a vulnerability. Promise me you'll be careful after I'm gone, that you won't let them abuse your generosity, your unconditional love." Thomas passed away on a quiet Sunday morning at home, as he had wished. He was holding my hand, and our son Michael was in the room with us, having arrived from San Francisco the night before. William and Elizabeth arrived a few hours later, after we had already transferred the body to the funeral home. I remember their formal embraces, their suppressed tears, the way they seemed more uncomfortable than truly grieving. The funeral was held 2 days later, a simple ceremony at the cemetery Thomas had chosen. Many co-workers attended, longtime friends, and some former students of mine who had known Thomas over the years. Our children behaved appropriately, accepting condolences and thanking everyone for coming, but there was something mechanical, something distant in their gestures and words. Or perhaps I was simply hypersensitive, weakened by the loss, misinterpreting normal signs of grief. It was a week after the funeral that Harold Jenkins contacted me, asking to schedule the official reading of the will. He suggested we meet in his office the following Monday so all the children could be present. I informed William, Elizabeth, and Michael about the meeting, and they all confirmed their attendance immediately. It was the first time since Thomas's diagnosis that I didn't hear excuses about busy schedules and unavoidable commitments. Everyone rearranged their schedules, canceled meetings, and postponed flights to be present at that specific moment. That should have been a wake-up call. On the appointed day, we arrived at Harold's office promptly at 1000 a.m. His office was in an old building in downtown Seattle with dark wood-paneled walls and bookshelves filled with legal books. Harold greeted us with the appropriate solemnity, led us into a spacious conference room, and asked us to sit around an oval table. He placed a thick folder in front of him, adjusted his reading glasses, and began to talk about legal procedures, the probate process, and how the formal transfer of assets would take place. I watched my children during this technical introduction. William leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on Harold, a visible tension in his posture. Elizabeth fidgeted constantly with the gold bracelet she wore, a graduation gift from Thomas. Michael seemed the calmest of the three, but his fingers drummed lightly on the table, revealing an anxiety he was trying to control. Finally, Harold opened the folder and began reading Thomas's will. The first words already made a visible impact. "I, Thomas Richard Anderson, in full possession of my mental faculties, declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and testaments. After careful consideration and deep reflection on human nature and the values I hold fundamental, I have made decisions that may surprise some, but which I believe are the most just and appropriate to preserve not only my material legacy, but also the principles that have guided my life." Continued reading, his clear, steady voice echoing in the quiet room. Thomas had decided that our house, fully paid off and valued at approximately $2.3 million, would go entirely to me. The joint bank accounts, totaling approximately $85,006, would also remain under my sole control. The stock and fund investments, totaling approximately $3.7 million also be transferred to my name, as would the 3 rental properties we owned, valued jointly at $1.8 million. As for his children, Thomas had left each of them $100,000 in cash to be transferred immediately, and the promise of a lifetime income of $2,000 a month from the rental income from the properties, provided I agreed to this arrangement. The will clearly specified that any future decisions regarding the distribution of the assets or changes in these amounts would be solely at my discretion, and that upon my death the remainder of the estate would be divided equally among the 3 children. Harold paused in his reading, peering over his glasses to gauge our reactions. The silence in the room was absolute, almost palpable. I looked at my children and saw expressions I will never forget. William's face was red with suppressed anger, his lips pressed into a thin line. Elizabeth had gone pale, her eyes wide with shock. Michael seemed frozen, as if struck physically. Harold continued, now reading a personal paragraph Thomas had included to my beloved wife Margaret. I leave not only material possessions, but the confidence that you will use these resources with the same wisdom, generosity, and discernment you demonstrated throughout our life together. To you, who shared every moment of our journey, who stood by me in times of joy and sorrow, I fully entrust the stewardship of all we have built. I know you will care for our children, but I also know you will need security and independence in this new phase of your life. To my children, William, Elizabeth, and Michael, I leave my unconditional love, but also the lesson that in life, as in death, there are consequences for our choices and actions. When Harold finished reading and closed the folder, the silence was broken by William, who stood abruptly, his chair scraping with a screeching noise on the hardwood floor. "This can't be right," he said, his voice shaking with indignation. "Dad wouldn't do this. He wouldn't leave practically everything to Mom and only ... crumbs for us. There must be a mistake, or worse, some kind of manipulation." Elizabeth joined him immediately, tears of frustration in her eyes. "I agree. Dad always talked about leaving us a legacy, about securing our future. This doesn't make sense. $2,000 a month, it's ridiculous considering the total assets." Michael, always the more controlled one, tried a different approach. "Mr. Jenkins, when exactly did Dad update this will? Was he on heavy medication at the time? Can we question his mental capacity when he made these decisions?" Harold responded with professional calm, explaining that Thomas had updated the will 8 months earlier when he was still in relatively good health, certainly in full possession of his mental faculties. He presented documents signed by 2 witnesses, in addition to himself attesting to Thomas's clear mental state at the time of signing. He clarified that the will had been carefully drafted to be legally incontestable, and that all decisions reflected Thomas's express and deliberate wishes. As this discussion unfolded, I remained silent, watching my children trying to process not only the contents of the will, but also their reaction. What I saw wasn't just disappointment or surprise, it was intense anger, indignation, as if a natural right had been denied them, as if money, property, were more important than respecting their father's last will, as if I, their own mother, were now an adversary, an obstacle between them and the fortune they had already mentally distributed and spent. Finally, I found my voice. "Thomas and I have built this wealth together over 35 years. Every investment, every decision was made together with our security in old age in mind. Of course, we always wanted to leave something for you, and the will provides for that. You will receive everything upon my death. But Thomas, in his wisdom, wanted to ensure that I would have financial independence and control over what we built together in my remaining years." William turned to me, his eyes hard, unrecognizable. "Mom, be realistic. You have no experience managing investments, managing properties." Dad was confused, didn't think straight. "The most sensible thing would be for us to divide everything immediately. You'd get a generous portion, of course, more than enough for your needs, and we'd manage the rest more efficiently." Elizabeth, always the more emotional one, took a different approach. "Mommy, think about your grandchildren, the great-grandchildren to come. Jason and I are trying to buy a bigger house, needing capital to invest in my design studio. William has important projects that require immediate investment. Michael is at a crucial stage with his startup. Are you really going to deny your children the opportunity to thrive, to fulfill the dreams Dad always wanted to see come true? Michael, more calculating, suggested we hire another lawyer to review. We'll look for legal loopholes and assess the possibility of a legal challenge. He spoke of precedents of wills being annulled due to undue influence or mental incapacity, insinuating that I might have manipulated Thomas during his illness to alter the will in my favor. I listened to all these words with a growing sense of nausea, of disbelief. Who were these people? Certainly not the loving, grateful children I thought I had raised. The greed so rawly exposed the lack of respect for their father's last will. The willingness to drag me into legal conflict of it hit me like physical blows, leaving me momentarily breathless. Harold, sensing my discomfort, intervened authoritatively. The will is legally sound and accurately reflects Mr. Anderson's expressed wishes. You are free to seek independent legal advice, but I must caution you that a legal challenge would likely be fruitless, extremely costly, and would certainly cause irreparable harm to your family. I suggest everyone take some time to process this information, to reflect calmly before making any rash decisions. The meeting ended shortly thereafter in a climate of palpable tension. We left Harold's office separately. My children followed together, whispering intensely, while I chose to walk alone to the car, desperately needing space to breathe, to process what had happened. Along the way, Thomas's words echoed in my mind. Promise me you'll be careful after I'm gone, that you won't let them abuse your generosity. Now I fully understood what he had anticipated, what he had tried to protect me from. The following days were a nightmare of calls, messages, and unannounced visits. My children adopted various strategies to try to convince me to ignore the will and divide the estate immediately. William used logical arguments, talking about efficiency, profitability, and how I would waste investment opportunities due to a lack of technical knowledge. Elizabeth appealed to my emotions, bringing her grandchildren for frequent visits, discussing their needs and how selfish it would be for me to hoard resources that could benefit the entire family immediately. Michael took a more aggressive approach, consulting lawyers, threatening lawsuits, and insinuating that I was not in the right emotional state to make financial decisions so soon after the loss of Thomas. The pressure was constant, suffocating. I began to question my own sanity, my judgment. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was selfish of me to maintain control over all that wealth. Maybe Thomas really wasn't thinking clearly when he updated the will. Doubts gnawed at me, sapping my confidence, leaving me exhausted and confused. It was at this moment of extreme fragility that I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah, Thomas's former secretary at the company, asked to see me. We had always maintained a cordial, if not close, relationship, and her presence surprised me. Sarah seemed nervous, hesitant, but determined. After accepting a cup of tea and exchanging a few pleasantries, she got straight to the point. Margaret, forgive me for intruding on family matters, but I feel I have a moral obligation to Thomas. He asked me to deliver this to you in case he felt you were being pressured after his death. Sarah pulled a sealed envelope from her purse with my name written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter and a flash drive. The letter began with words that instantly brought tears to my eyes. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means my suspicions have been confirmed and our children are trying to manipulate you into ignoring my final wishes. Forgive me for not being completely honest about my concerns, but I did not want to add more sadness to your last moments with me. Thomas continued to explain, in painful detail, behaviors and conversations he had witnessed over the past few years that had gradually eroded his trust in our children's values and character. He spoke of insensitive comments, the way they treated people they considered inferior, their obsession with status and material possessions, their lack of empathy and gratitude. He recounted conversations he had inadvertently overheard between them, discussing what they would do with his share of the inheritance while he was still fighting for his life. The letter continued, the flash drive contains recordings of some of these conversations as well as emails and messages. I was able to recover. I didn't do this out of pettiness or a desire for posthumous control, but to give you the strength I know you'll need when you face the pressure that will surely come. You've always seen the best in our children, always justified their behavior, always believed that deep down they were good and just people. This unshakable faith is one of your most admirable qualities, but right now you need to see reality as it is. I continued reading, tears streaming freely down my face. Thomas detailed his decisions regarding the will, explaining that he had structured everything to protect me and ensure my independence. He believed I needed complete control over the resources to avoid being manipulated to be able to make decisions based on merit and real need, not on emotional blackmail or pressure. He also expressed the hope that in time our children would be able to reflect, mature, and recognize their own mistakes and limitations. If they demonstrate true change, true repentance, you will be free to help them in any way you deem appropriate. If not, at least you will be protected, independent, able to live out your remaining years with dignity and security. This is my final gift to you, Margaret, not just financial resources, but the truth, however painful, and the freedom that comes with that truth. Sarah waited patiently as I read, respecting my silence, my tears. When I finally looked up from the letter, she spoke softly. Thomas showed me some of those recordings. He was devastated, Margaret. Not so much by their greed, but by the betrayal of what you both always tried to teach, the values you tried to impart. He wanted to protect you, to give you the tools to defend yourself when he was no longer here. I thanked Sarah, genuinely touched by her loyalty to Thomas, by her courage in keeping that promise. After she left, I spent the entire night listening to the recordings on the flash drive, reading the emails and messages. It was all even worse than Thomas had described. Explicit conversations about how they would divide the inheritance, about extravagant projects they would undertake with the money, about how I probably wouldn't live long after. Thomas and they would soon have access to everything. Discussions about how they would manipulate me after Thomas's death, what emotional buttons they would push, what strategies they would use to convince me to ignore the will. The most shocking of the recordings was a conversation between the three of them in a restaurant while Thomas was hospitalized after a major surgery. William spoke about a risky real estate venture he had secretly invested in using borrowed money, counting on his share of the inheritance to cover the investment before creditors began to press in. Elizabeth mentioned significant debts she and her husband had accumulated, constantly living beyond their means, also counting on the imminent inheritance to solve their financial problems. Michael revealed that his startup was on the verge of bankruptcy, that he had lied to investors about its profit potential, and that he urgently needed new capital to avoid a complete collapse and potential legal action. In that conversation, they spoke of Thomas and me as if we were already dead, as if we were merely temporary obstacles between them and the money they considered rightfully theirs. The coldness, the calculation, the utter lack of consideration for our feelings, for our grief, all of it made me physically ill. I spent hours in the bathroom vomiting from sheer shock and disgust, feeling as if the entire foundation of my life, of my identity as a mother, had been suddenly ripped from under me. By the time morning arrived, something had fundamentally shifted within me. The confusion, the doubts, the guilt, all had been replaced by a crystal clarity, a determination I had never experienced before. Thomas was right. Our children had become people we didn't recognize, guided by values we never tried to instill in them. And now my responsibility was not only to protect myself, but also to honor Thomas's final will, the final act of love, and protection from a man who had seen the truth before I had. That same day, I took decisive action. I called Harold and asked him to come to my house urgently. When he arrived, I showed him Thomas's letter and some of the recordings. Harold didn't seem entirely surprised. He suspected there was more to the story than Thomas had officially documented. Together, we devised a plan to protect the estate and establish clear boundaries with my children. First, Harold helped me draft a formal letter sent from his office to each of my children. The letter informed me that I had been made aware of their discussions and plans regarding the inheritance, that I was deeply disappointed by their behavior, and that I had decided to fully respect Thomas's wishes as expressed in his will. It further stated that any attempted legal challenge would be defended with all available legal remedies, including the presentation of the recordings as evidence of intentional manipulation of the inheritance process. We then transferred all bank accounts to new accounts in my sole name at different banks than we had previously used. We began the formal process of transferring the property titles into my name. We hired a reputable property management company to manage the rental properties, eliminating the need for direct involvement that could have left me vulnerable to manipulation. We reviewed and updated all investments with the help of an independent financial advisor recommended by Harold. Finally, and perhaps the most difficult step, I changed the house's locks and activated a security system that allowed me to control who had access to the property. Not that I expected a physical break-in, but the symbolic gesture was important. This was my home now, and access to it would be on my terms, not theirs. The reaction to the letter was swift and explosive. William called me immediately, his voice alternating between open anger and attempts at manipulation. He accused me of spying, invading privacy, and taking conversations out of context. When that didn't work, he tried to downplay the recordings, saying they were just hypothetical conversations, that everyone says things they don't mean when they're stressed. Finally, he threatened legal action, asserting that no judge would accept recordings obtained without consent as valid evidence. Elizabeth took a different approach. She showed up at my door crying, profusely admitting they'd made errors of judgment, but insisting that deep down, they were only concerned about my well-being, my ability to manage complex financial matters. After so many years of letting Thomas handle them, she begged for forgiveness, for understanding, for a solution that worked for everyone. When she realized I wasn't giving, her tone changed dramatically. She accused me of never having truly loved her, of always preferring her brothers, of being a cold and manipulative mother who was now showing her true colors. Michael, ever the calculating one, tried a legal approach. He sent his own lawyer to discuss amicable options that would avoid a public and painful family conflict. Lawyer presented a settlement proposal that essentially ignored the will and immediately divided the estate into 4 parts, 1 for me, 1 for each child. When I flatly refused, the lawyer implied that my children were prepared for a protracted legal battle, including possible allegations about my mental capacity after the trauma of losing Thomas. I stood firm in the face of all these pressures, these manipulations, these veiled and overt threats. The pain was immense, a harsh word. Each unjust accusation, each attempt at manipulation was like a knife twisting in my heart. But the clarity I had found that morning after listening to the recordings remained unshaken. Thomas had foreseen this very thing, had prepared me in the only way he could, and I would not betray his trust, his foresight, his final act of protection. The threats of legal action came to fruition 3 weeks later. I received a formal summons. My 3 children jointly were contesting Thomas's will, alleging mental incapacity due to pain medication and undue influence on my part during his period of vulnerability. The petition requested that the will be nullified and that the distribution of assets followed the state's standard probate law, which would give each of the children a significant share of the estate immediately. Harold had prepared me for this possibility. We already had all the necessary documentation statements, from doctors attesting to Thomas's lucidity when he updated the will depositions, from the witnesses who signed the document records of independent consultations Thomas had had with other attorneys before finalizing his decisions. We also had, of course, the recordings, which Harold believed were admissible as evidence since they had been made in public spaces with no reasonable expectation of privacy. The process was painful, dragging on for months. Depositions, preliminary hearings, attempted settlements that invariably involved me relinquishing the control Thomas had deliberately granted me. The tension was constant, exhausting. I lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and often woke in the middle of the night with my heart racing images of my children's angry faces, haunting me even in my dreams. What sustained me through this hellish time was not only my determination to honor Thomas's wishes, but also an unexpected network of support that formed around me. Sarah remained present, offering not only insight into Thomas's mental state in recent months, but also genuine friendship, a shoulder to cry on, and a constant and reliable presence. Martin Weber Thomas's former colleague also spoke up for me, sharing stories of conversations he had had with Thomas about his concerns about his children's values and expectations. Surprisingly, some longtime friends, who had initially drifted away uncomfortable with the family conflict, began returning, offering emotional support, companionship, and welcome distractions from the constant tension of the process. My sister Janet, who lived in another state, and with whom I didn't have frequent contact, came to spend a few weeks with me, bringing her comforting presence, her good humor, and her ability to make me laugh even in the darkest moments. The final trial date was set for a Monday, exactly 1 year and 2 months after Thomas's death. In the days leading up to it, I could barely eat or sleep. The thought of facing my own children in court, of hearing their false claims, their distortions of the truth, was almost unbearable. Janet insisted on staying with me through the trial, promising to be by my side in court, holding my hand, offering the strength I feared I couldn't find alone. On the morning of the trial, I woke before dawn after a restless night's sleep. I sat on the back porch, looking out at the garden Thomas had so lovingly tended, breathing in the fresh morning air, trying to find calm amid the approaching storm. It was in that moment, alone with my thoughts, that I made a decision that surprised even myself: would bring the recordings to court, but would not use them unless absolutely necessary. I didn't make this decision out of weakness or a return to denial about who my children had become. I made it because, despite everything, they were still my children. Publicly exposing the worst of them, completely humiliating them in a packed courtroom, might bring an immediate legal victory, but it would permanently close any door to future reconciliation. And even after everything that had happened, a small part of me still hoped that someday, somehow, we could find a way back to each other. We arrived at the courthouse promptly at 9:00 a.m. Harold met us on the steps of the imposing stone building, his face serious but confident. "We are well prepared, Margaret. The will is solid, the documentation is impeccable. The judge has a history of rigorously upholding the wishes expressed in legally valid wills. Stay calm, answer only what is asked, and let me lead the defense." The courtroom was already packed when we entered. Besides the directly involved parties, there were curious onlookers, local journalists drawn by the story of a family dispute involving a significant estate and law, students observing a real-life will contest case. I sat at the defense table with Harold and his assistant, while Janet occupied the front bench in the gallery directly behind me. Across the hall at the prosecution table sat my 3 sons with their lawyers, a team of 3 impeccably dressed professionals with confident expressions and thick folders of documents in front of them. William didn't even glance in my direction, his eyes fixed on his lawyers, occasionally jotting notes on a pad. Elizabeth shot me a quick glance, a mixture of anger and something else I couldn't quite identify, before looking away. Michael kept his head down, apparently studying documents, his face partially obscured. The judge entered, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and shrewd eyes, and everyone rose. After the initial formalities, the trial began with opening statements. My children's lead attorney, a tall, booming-voiced man named Robert Carson, presented his theory of the case with studied eloquence. He spoke of Thomas as a brilliant, generous man who had always valued family above all else, who certainly would not have intentionally left his beloved children with such a small fraction of his estate if he had been in his right mind. He painted a picture of Thomas, weakened by illness, confused by medication, vulnerable to outside influence, specifically my influence. He insinuated that I had exploited this moment of vulnerability to manipulate the will in my favor, possibly motivated by long-held resentment toward my children, or perhaps simply by a selfish desire for absolute control. He presented a detailed chronology of the medications Thomas was taking when he updated the will, highlighting possible cognitive side effects. It was difficult to hear these distortions, these blatant lies about my relationship with Thomas, about my motivations, about his mental state during those last months. I felt my hands tremble, my stomach twist into knots. Janet, sensing my distress, leaned forward and gently touched my shoulder, a silent reminder that I was not alone. When it was Harold's turn, his approach was completely different, calm, factual, direct. He presented medical documentation that clearly indicated Thomas was lucid and oriented when he updated the will despite his physical illness. He showed records of consultations Thomas had with 3 different attorneys before finalizing his decisions, evidencing careful deliberation, not impulse or confusion. He cited specific legal precedents that established the high standard of evidence required to nullify a properly signed and witnessed will. As for the claim that I had exerted undue influence, Harold methodically demolished it. He presented records showing that Thomas had initially consulted with other attorneys without my presence, that the final structure of the will had been his idea, not mine, and that he had expressed similar concerns about his children's financial habits and expectations to numerous friends and colleagues over the years. This was not an impulsive or manipulated will, Harold concluded, but the result of careful thought by a man who knew his family intimately and wished to protect both his wife and his legacy. After the opening statements, the testimony began. My children's side first presented the doctor, who had treated Thomas during his illness, questioning him about the possible cognitive effects of the medication. The doctor, an older man with decades of experience, was undaunted. He admitted that the medication could cause some confusion in some patients, but categorically stated that Thomas had maintained his lucidity and decision-making ability until very near the end. Mr. Anderson was an exceptional patient, the doctor declared. He asked incisive questions about his treatment, discussed options with unusual clarity, and remained informed about his condition. I never observed any significant impairment of his cognitive faculties or judgment. Next, they called in a forensic psychology expert who had never met Thomas but was willing to speculate about his possible mental state based on medical records and the unusual pattern of estate distribution in the will. This testimony was harder to hear, harder for Harold to effectively counter. The expert used impressive technical terms, cited studies on decision-making in terminally ill patients, and suggested that the combination of medications, chronic pain, and proximity to death could have affected Thomas's judgment in subtle but significant ways. When it was our turn to present witnesses, Harold began with Sarah. Her testimony was powerful in its simplicity and sincerity. She spoke about Thomas in his final months, clearly determined, concerned about the future, especially my well-being after his departure. She described specific conversations in which Thomas had expressed concern about his children's expectations and values, and how they seemed to assume they would have immediate access to a substantial inheritance. Sarah spoke in a clear, firm voice, looking directly at the judge, occasionally casting compassionate glances in my direction. Martin Weber testified next, corroborating Sarah's account of Thomas's mental state and concerns. As a longtime colleague, Martin was able to contextualize Thomas's final decisions within a consistent pattern of financial caution, of value placed on independence and self-sufficiency, and concern about the potentially negative effects of unearned wealth. Thomas always said he wanted his children to build their own lives, their own successes, Martin explained. He worried that inheriting too much too soon without restrictions could impede that development, that satisfaction of personal achievement. Harold also called the 2 witnesses who had signed the will, both of whom attested to Thomas's lucidity and clarity at the time of the signing. One of them, a retired lawyer who knew Thomas socially, was particularly emphatic. "I've worked with wills for 40 years. I recognize coercion, confusion, or undue influence. There was none of that with Thomas. He knew exactly what he was doing, exactly why, and was at peace with his decisions." Finally, it was my turn to testify. I stepped onto the witness stand with shaky legs but firm determination. I swore to tell the truth, sat down, and met the judge's gaze. Harold skillfully guided my testimony, allowing me to describe my relationship with Thomas, our joint, financial planning over the years, and the conversations we had during his illness about the future, his wishes, and his concerns. I spoke honestly about how I hadn't initially fully understood his concerns about his children, how I'd tried to justify behaviors he saw as red flags. I described how he'd insisted on leaving me financially independent, on giving me full control over the resources we built together. Thomas believed I would need this independence, this control, to rebuild my life. Without him, I explained, my voice choked but firm. Not out of selfishness or a desire to exclude our children, but out of love for myself and for them, believing that over time the need to prove their own worth, to build their own lives, would ultimately be beneficial to their development as human beings. When it was time for cross-examination, Carson approached with a confident, almost predatory expression. His questions were aggressive, insinuating, designed to destabilize me emotionally. He questioned my understanding of family finances, insinuating that I had left all the decisions to Thomas out of inability, not choice. He suggested that I had manipulated a sick and vulnerable man, taking advantage of moments of medication indigestion. He asked if I didn't feel guilty for depriving my own children of their just inheritance. I took a deep breath before answering each question, determined not to let him push me to the point of losing control. Mr. Carson, Thomas and I made financial decisions together for 35 years. He had more technical knowledge. I brought different complementary perspectives. As for manipulation, I suggest you review the medical records again. My husband maintained his lucidity and independence of mind until very near the end. And as for guilt, the only thing I would feel guilty about would be ignoring the explicit wishes of the man I loved for over 3 decades, the man who tried to protect us all in his own way. Carson kept pressing, trying different angles, searching for contradictions, inconsistencies. At one point, he mentioned the letter and the recordings, insinuating that they were fabrications, manipulated evidence created after the fact to strengthen my position. It was at that point that I seriously considered releasing the recordings in open court, letting everyone hear the voices of my children coldly discussing how they would divide their inheritance, while their father still fought for his life in a hospital. I glanced briefly in their direction. William still avoided my gaze. Elizabeth bit her lip. Nervously, Michael finally raised his eyes and met mine briefly, something like fear or embarrassment flashing across his face. I decided to stick to my original resolution. The recordings exist, Mr. Carson, and they are available as evidence if the court deems it necessary. I prefer not to release them unless absolutely essential to uphold Thomas's will. After 3 grueling days of testimony, arguments, presentation of documents and legal precedents, the trial finally reached closing arguments. Carson was once again eloquent, emotional, appealing to traditional notions of family inheritance and children's rights. She painted me as manipulative, as a bitter widow trying to punish her children for long-held resentments, denying them what was naturally theirs by birthright. Harold, in contrast, was again factual, methodical, and legal. He reminded the judge of the high standards of evidence required to overturn a valid will, the lack of concrete evidence of mental incapacity or undue influence, and the consistency of Thomas's decisions with his lifelong values. This court should not substitute its judgment for that of Thomas Anderson, Harold concluded. The question is not whether Mr. Anderson made the decisions that Your Honor or anyone else would make under similar circumstances, but whether he had the legal right to make the decisions he did. And clearly he did. The judge announced that he would consider all arguments and evidence and would issue his written decision within a week. We left the courtroom emotionally exhausted, uncertain of the outcome, but with the clear knowledge that we had defended Thomas's wishes to the best of our ability. The week of waiting was one of the longest of my life. I alternated between moments of confidence and periods of acute PHS. of acute PHS scenarios, worrying about the consequences of a possible defeat. Janet stayed with me throughout that week, distracting me with old movies, walks in the park, and conversations about everything except the trial and its possible outcomes. Finally, on a sunny Friday, we've got Harold's call. His voice on the phone sounded triumphant. "We won, Margaret. The judge upheld the will in its entirety. His decision is extremely clear and firm. There is no evidence of mental incapacity or undue influence, and the court will not substitute its judgment for Thomas's. You retain complete control, just as Thomas wanted." The relief was so intense that my legs gave way and I had to sit down quickly. Janet, seeing my reaction, picked up the phone and asked Harold for more details while I tried to process the fact that it was finally over, that Thomas's wishes would be respected, that I wouldn't have to choose between honoring his final wish and maintaining some kind of relationship with my children. Harold explained that the judge had been particularly critical in his written decision, noting that the children had presented no concrete evidence of mental incapacity beyond speculation, and that their claims of undue influence seemed based more on disappointment with the will's contents than on any actual evidence of manipulation. In fact, Harold said the judge mentioned that Mrs. Anderson's reluctance to present certain potentially damaging evidence to her children spoke positively of her character and motivations. When I hung up the phone, Janet hugged me tightly, tears of relief in her eyes mirroring my own. "It's over, Margaret. You did what Thomas wanted, what he knew was necessary. Now you can begin to heal, to rebuild, to find a new path." That night, for the first time in months, I slept soundly without nightmares, without waking up startled in the middle of the night. When morning came, I felt different, lighter, stronger, clearer about the path ahead. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted, not only from my shoulders, but also from my soul. The court's decision didn't erase the pain of betrayal, the profound disappointment in my children, but it somehow validated my choices, my determination to honor Thomas's wishes. In the days that followed, I expected some contact from my children, phone call, a message, maybe even a visit. Nothing came. The silence was deafening, but not unexpected. I knew they would need time to process the legal defeat, to face the consequences of their choices, to perhaps eventually reflect on what their actions revealed about their character and their values. While I waited, I began the process of rebuilding. I returned to old hobbies I'd abandoned during marriage and children, painting classes, a book club, gardening, returned to teaching part-time, discovering a renewed joy in connecting with young minds and sharing my love of literature. With the help of Sarah, who had become a close friend, I volunteered at a local children's hospital, offering a few hours a week to read to inpatients. Financial matters, which initially seemed so daunting, gradually became more manageable. With guidance from the financial advisor Harold had recommended, I learned about investing, wealth management, and long-term financial planning. The property management company efficiently managed the rental properties, generating a steady monthly income that, combined with the investment returns, provided me with a comfortable and secure life. It was approximately 3 months after the court ruling that I received the first contact from one of my sons. To my surprise, it was Michael who made the first move, sending a brief but meaningful email. There was no explicit apology, but the tone was different, more humble, less accusatory. He mentioned that his startup had completely failed, that he had learned valuable lessons about unrealistic expectations and inadequate planning, and that he was starting over with a regular job at an established company. He tentatively asked if we could grab coffee sometime just to catch up. I replied the same day, agreeing to meet, suggesting a neutral coffee shop downtown. We met a week later, an initially tense encounter filled with awkward silences and hesitations. Michael seemed thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, his usual air of confidence replaced by something closer to humility. He talked about the past few months, the company's bankruptcy, legal troubles with disgruntled investors, the end of a relationship, the need to start over from scratch at 28. He didn't directly mention the will or the lawsuit, but at one point he looked at me with surprisingly sincere eyes and said, Dad was right, about a lot of things, about me specifically. I wasn't ready for the kind of responsibility a substantial inheritance would bring. Maybe I still am not. I didn't answer immediately, watching his face searching for signs of manipulation, of deceit. I found none, only weariness, regret, perhaps the beginnings of a hard-won wisdom. Your father loved you, Michael. He loved all of you deeply. His decisions were motivated by that love, not its absence. We talked for almost 2 hours about memories of Thomas, about mistakes made, about possibilities for a new beginning. There were no major revelations or dramatic reconciliations, but when we said goodbye, something was different between us. A small space opened where before there had been only hurt and anger, a faint possibility of rebuilding, of a new kind of relationship based on reality, not illusions. Elizabeth was the next to contact me a few weeks later. She called on a Sunday afternoon, her voice hesitant, almost unrecognizable. She asked if she could visit me with the children so they wouldn't completely lose their connection with their grandmother. I agreed, setting only one clear condition: no discussion of financial matters, wills, or lawsuits in front of the children. The visit was surprisingly pleasant. Elizabeth seemed different, less tense, less focused on appearances. During a moment when the children were playing in the garden, she briefly mentioned that she and her husband had moved to a smaller apartment, more suited to their financial situation, and that they were learning to live within their means for the first time. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. The important thing was that the children were there laughing, playing, reconnecting with me, and that a small line of communication had been reopened between me and my only daughter. William was the most resistant, remaining completely silent for nearly 6 months after the court ruling. When he finally made contact, it was through a formal letter sent by regular mail. The letter was a strange mix of wounded pride and reluctant acknowledgement. It explained that his real estate venture had completely failed, resulting in substantial debt and a humiliating personal bankruptcy. He mentioned that he had accepted a much more modest position at a small real estate firm, starting over from the basics, learning how to build a solid business, without shortcuts or risky schemes. The only direct reference to our conflict came in the penultimate paragraph. I recognize now that my expectations were unrealistic and, in retrospect, deeply selfish. I'm not asking for financial help, my need to find my own way, prove myself. But I hope that in time we can rebuild some kind of family relationship, however different it may be from what we had before. I responded with an equally thoughtful letter, opening the door to future communication without pressure or unrealistic expectations. I mentioned that I would be willing to meet with him when he felt ready on his terms, with no conditions other than basic mutual respect. The reply came a few weeks later, a simple card with an even simpler message: "Thank you for your understanding. I need some more time, William." Today, 2 years after the court ruling, 4 years after Thomas's death, our family is slowly finding a new balance. It's not the idealized family I imagined for decades, but something more real, more honest, with clearer boundaries and more realistic expectations. Michael and I meet regularly for lunch or walks in the park, cautious but increasingly authentic conversations about life, work, and relationships. Elizabeth brings her children for monthly visits and occasionally joins me for painting or gardening sessions, activities we share in comfortable silence, rebuilding connection without words. William still maintains his distance but sends cards unsignificant, dates, and recently suggested a lunch. When you're ready, no pressure. As for me, I discovered a strength I never knew I possessed, a capacity for independence that had lain dormant during decades of living in a partnership. I learned to make decisions on my own, to trust my own judgment, to find pleasure in small daily achievements. The house that once seemed too big, too empty without Thomas became a refuge, a space all my own, to fill with new memories, new friendships, new projects. I established a small foundation in Thomas's name, using a modest portion of the investment proceeds to provide scholarships to low-income youth interested in engineering or technology. It's a way to keep his legacy alive, to honor his values of hard work, education, and self-development. I occasionally share information about the foundation with my children without pressuring them to get involved, but leaving the door open for future participation when and if they're ready. The pain of betrayal will never completely fade. There are moments when memories return vividly. My children's faces contorted with rage in court, the cruel words spoken in moments of frustration, the willingness to destroy our family out of greed. But these painful memories now share space, with new, more hopeful ones. Michael's look of genuine remorse as he admitted his father was right, the carefree laughter of his grandchildren playing in the garden during Elizabeth's visits, William's recent card with the simple but meaningful message, thinking of you. Hope you are well. If Thomas could see our family now, I believe he would feel a complex mix of sadness and validation. Sadness for the suffering we all experienced, for the temporary, perhaps permanent in some ways, rupture of the family bonds he deeply valued. But also validation for his accurate foresight, for his deeper understanding of the character and needs of each family member, for his final attempt to protect both his material legacy and the values he held dear. The words I heard in that courtroom, "She doesn't belong here, throw her out," still echo occasionally in my mind, a painful reminder of how fragile family bonds can be when tested by greed and entitlement. But today, I can look back with a different perspective, seeing that moment not only as a devastating betrayal, but also as the catalyst for personal growth that would never have happened otherwise. It was in the shattered fragments of my illusions about the perfect family that I finally found my own voice, my own strength, my own identity, separate from the roles of wife and mother that had defined me for so long. And when the lawyer read that single line that changed everything, revealing that the inheritance was all mine, it wasn't just a legal or financial victory, it was a final gift from Thomas, an opportunity for self-discovery, for self-affirmation, for rebuilding on completely new terms. In his final acts of love, Thomas not only protected me financially, but gave me the chance to discover who I truly was, what I was capable of, how I could flourish even after devastating losses. The plea my children's cruelty turned into when they realized they wouldn't have immediate access to the fortune they'd hoped for brought no satisfaction, only profound sadness for what they had become. But today, seeing the first tentative signs of genuine change, of painful but necessary growth, I feel something close to hope. Not for a return to what we were before, that's impossible, perhaps even undesirable, but for the possibility of something new, something more authentic, something built on a more solid foundation of truth, respect, and healthy boundaries. If you identified with my story, please leave a like so it can reach others who may be going through similar family conflicts. In the comments, tell me if you've ever experienced something similar or what you would do if you were in my shoes. And subscribe to the channel for more real stories like this. Stories of pain and loss, but also of overcoming and rediscovery. Remember that families are complex, imperfect, sometimes deeply disappointing entities, but also always part of who we are, for better or worse. Thanks for listening, and until the next story.